early winter arrived in 1889 without ceremony. Snow had not yet settled, but the ground in the northern valley had already stiffened, and the air carried the sharp, dry cold that preceded deeper storms. The settlement stood scattered along the tree line, its cabins built low and square, shaped more by habit than planning. It was here that Elias Harrow, 18 years of age, began lining the inside walls of his one-room cabin with pine bark. If you enjoy these documented frontier survival stories, please like, share, and subscribe. Which cabin do you think would have stayed warm through the winter? Elias's bark-lined walls or a standard log cabin? The idea drew attention immediately. Bark was used for fuel, for kindling, sometimes for roofing in sheds, but never for interior walls. Elias worked without explanation, stripping long sheets from fallen pine, stacking them to dry, then fastening them between the logs and the inner planking. The layers thickened the walls by several inches. From the outside, nothing appeared different. Inside, the cabin grew darker and narrower. Men passing by slowed to watch. One laughed and asked if he planned to live inside a tree. Another remarked that bark belonged outside, where weather could finish what rot had started. The settlement's appointed authority, a man responsible for land records and winter counts, shook his head and said nothing would stop the cold once it decided to enter. Elias did not respond. He continued measuring, cutting, and fitting each piece by hand. The work took time. Bark had to be dried just enough to resist mold, but not so much that it cracked. Nails were used sparingly. Where gaps remained, Elias pressed in needles, moss, and packed earth. His hands stayed raw despite gloves. Each evening, he swept the floor and checked the walls for loosened sections. The season advanced. Daylight shortened. Wind came down from the higher slopes and lingered in the valley, testing doors and shutters. Smoke from nearby cabins began to hang low, refusing to rise. People spoke more often about last winters, about frozen wells, about nights when fires burned through wood too quickly to last until morning. Mockery followed Elias openly now. Some called the bark lining a child's experiment. Others said it was wasted effort better spent hauling more firewood. Elias accepted neither advice nor ridicule. He had observed how pine resisted cold when standing, how animals sheltered beneath its fallen bark, how frost crept slower through forest litter than through bare ground. By the time the first heavy clouds gathered over the ridge, the walls were complete. The cabin smelled of resin and earth. Elias sat inside one evening and listened as wind moved through the valley. The fire burned low. Outside, the temperature continued to fall, steady and unannounced, as it always did. Those watching expected the cold to arrive without exception. They laughed because they had seen winter's wind before. None of them yet knew what the bark would do when the real cold came. The valley sat high enough to collect cold and hold it. Ridges rose on three sides, blocking sun in the shortest months and funneling wind through a narrow pass from the north. Snowfall came unevenly, drifting deep against cabins while leaving other ground bare and frozen. Old maps marked the place only by a river bend and a survey line. Those who lived there learned its measures by loss. Winters were remembered by what failed: a horse found stiff beside a fence, a roof pressed inward by weight, a child sent south before frost and never returned. The climate was not violent, only persistent. Temperatures fell slowly, then stayed. Fires burned constantly. Wood piles shrank faster than expected. Breath showed even indoors on certain mornings. The settlement's authority, tasked with recording deaths and departures, had seen these patterns repeat. He said the valley rewarded preparation, not experiment. Bark, he told others, was for the forest floor. Logs, earth, and fire were the only proven defenses. Cold finds its way, he said once, while counting stores. It always does. Community members repeated older accounts as the days shortened. One spoke of sheep lost in a single night when a wind shifted. Another recalled an elderly woman whose stove failed before dawn. These stories were not warnings so much as statements of record. They carried no drama. Everyone present already understood the ending. Elias Harrow continued his work within this setting. Each morning, he checked the bark-lined walls for moisture. Each evening, he hauled wood. He repaired his door twice, tightening the fit as the boards contracted. When wind rose, he listened for gaps. He added material where sound traveled too freely. If you appreciate the detailed record of frontier survival, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Elevation shaped everything. Wells froze early. Paths hardened into rutted ice. The river slowed but did not stop, its surface breaking open at intervals where current resisted the cold. The valley floor acted as a basin, collecting air that never fully warmed once winter took hold. Even on clear days, the sun left early. The authority figure passed Elias's cabin again, late in the month. Smoke rose evenly from the chimney. He remarked to another man that youth often mistook effort for improvement. The other agreed. No one entered the cabin. There was nothing yet to test. Livestock were brought closer to homes. Older residents limited movement. Tools were laid out where they could be reached without searching. People measured distance now by the effort required to cross it. The valley narrowed in practical terms. Elias said little. When asked how much wood he planned to cut, he answered with a number and returned to work. His hands remained split. His routine did not change. Outside, the wind settled into a steady direction. Snow clouds gathered without urgency. The valley had reduced men before, not by sudden force, but by steady demand. It required attention each day and punished small errors over time. As December approached, the settlement prepared in familiar ways. Elias prepared differently, within walls that smelled of pine and earth, waiting for the cold to decide whether it would enter or not. No one argued openly with his choice anymore. Laughter faded into indifference as labor increased elsewhere. The valley demanded hours, not opinions. Frost traced the inside of other windows. Doors swelled and stuck. At night, wind pressed against structures as if testing them in sequence. The bark-lined cabin stood among them without distinction, one more shape against the trees, waiting under the same sky. No record noted it then, but the measure of that winter had already begun, quietly, before the first true storm arrived. In silence. Each day followed a pattern that left little room for speculation. Elias Harrow rose before full light, when frost still clung to the ground and the valley lay quiet. He walked to the tree line with an axe, selecting fallen pine whose bark loosened cleanly from the trunk. Stripping it took patience. The outer layers came away in long sheets, damp and cold to the touch. He stacked them against a shed wall, angled so air could pass through and dry them slowly over several days rather than hours. By midday, he worked inside. Bark that had cured enough was trimmed and pressed into the wall spaces. He measured by handspan rather than rule, fitting each piece until resistance held it firm. Where cracks remained, he filled them with needles, moss, and packed soil. The cabin grew darker, and the air carried a steady resin smell that clung to clothing. He paused often to clear ice from the doorway as thawed snow refroze. Routine drew observers. Men passed without stopping, offering remarks that required no reply. One said the walls would sweat and rot by spring. Another asked how long before insects moved in. Elias answered only when a question demanded it. "It keeps its shape," he said once, tapping the bark with his knuckle. The exchange ended there, as most did. Mockery settled into habit rather than conflict. It arrived at the same hours each day, like wind, and passed just as easily. No one interfered with the work. Wood was cut closer now. Livestock were brought in early. Smoke gathered low and refused to rise, spreading along the ground between cabins. Follow along by liking, sharing, and subscribing as we continue documenting life in the northern frontier. Weather pressed steadily. Snow fell, thawed, then froze again. Each cycle tested seams and doors. Elias adjusted where sound carried through the walls. He added another layer along the north side and tightened the frame around the stovepipe. His hands stayed cracked despite wrapping. At night he slept lightly, waking to check the fire and press a palm against the walls for dampness. Practical concerns replaced argument. A neighbor asked how much bark he had stored. Elias gave a number. Another asked if the fire drew well. He nodded. No one asked whether it would work. By week's end, the interior temperature shifted little between morning and evening. This was noted without comment. Outside, frost thickened on window frames elsewhere. Elias kept to his routine, stripping bark when weather allowed and repairing when it did not. Public doubt remained, but it no longer demanded answers. The valley moved toward winter in measured steps, and Elias moved with it, steady and unremarked, waiting for conditions that would give his labor its meaning. Cold arrived in stages rather than all at once. Nights dropped below freezing, then climbed just enough by afternoon to loosen nails and dampen stored goods. Cabins that had seemed sound in autumn began to show strain. Drafts formed along floor seams. Frost traced patterns on interior walls, thickest where logs met unevenly. Food stores were the first to suffer. Salt pork hardened beyond cutting. Flour took on moisture and clumped. Root cellars flooded when shallow ground ice forced meltwater inward. People adjusted by burning more wood and keeping fires through the night, but that solution shortened supplies faster than planned. An elderly man living near the river felt the cold earliest. His hands shook when he worked the stove. He slept in layers and still woke with numb feet. Neighbors checked on him in daylight, bringing coals wrapped in cloth or an extra blanket. He spoke little and conserved movement, knowing strength would be needed later. Other cabins fared no better. One roof leaked where snow thawed against the chimney. Another door warped and refused to close fully, leaving a gap that whistled when wind shifted. Repairs were made in haste, often in poor light, and held only briefly. Each fix required more time, more fuel, more effort. The settlement took note without comment. These were familiar signs. Early cold always tested assumptions made during warmer months. People recalculated distances, choosing when to visit and when to stay put. Livestock were moved again, closer to shelter, their breath hanging low and steady. Elias Harrow's cabin remained largely unremarked. Smoke rose at regular intervals. The door opened and closed without sticking. When he crossed the yard, he did so quickly, but not hurriedly. Inside conditions were noted only in passing. Someone remarked that the fire seemed smaller than expected. Another noticed the absence of frost on the inner window frame. No one lingered to examine it. Work continued elsewhere. Ice was chipped from troughs each morning. Tools were kept indoors to prevent cracking. The authority figure recorded minor losses and adjusted counts. He did not visit Elias's cabin, nor did he ask about the bark lining again. Cold deepened. Wind found paths that had gone unnoticed for years. It pressed against walls and slipped through old seams, lifting ash and carrying it across floors. People slept closer to their stoves. Some began closing off unused corners of rooms to reduce space. If records like these matter, viewers may choose to like, subscribe, or share them quietly. The work continues either way. The elderly man by the river failed to light his stove one morning. Neighbors arrived before noon and found the firebox cold. They relit it and stayed until warmth returned to the room. He survived the day, but movement cost him more each week. Through this period, the bark-lined cabin offered no clear proof. Its walls were thicker, its air steadier, but winter had not yet made its full demand. The valley remained in an early phase of testing, revealing weaknesses gradually rather than all at once. Tension gathered quietly without event, as if waiting for a colder measure to be applied. No one spoke of success or failure yet. The cold had only begun to sort materials, habits, and bodies. The valley observed without judgment, keeping its deeper trials in reserve while recording the first small losses in silence. Snow began to stay on shaded ground. Paths narrowed where feet repeated the same careful steps. Each morning required more time to prepare, more effort to reach the same tasks. The settlement adapted in small ways, storing heat where possible and accepting discomfort where it could not be avoided. These adjustments marked the opening phase of winter, when endurance was measured quietly and outcomes remained uncertain. Nothing decisive had happened yet, but experience suggested that the valley rarely revealed its full intent until conditions became inescapable for everyone present there now. Midwinter settled with deliberate persistence. Sub-zero temperatures held for days, and snowstorms followed one another with little pause. Travel between cabins ceased entirely. The valley, once dotted with movement and distant smoke trails, became a place defined by stillness. Paths hardened into slick ice, and the river slowed under layers of frost, leaving only a narrow channel of flowing water that ran beneath sheets of fragile ice. Smoke from stoves clung to the ground, weaving between cabins and lingering where wind dropped suddenly. Inside, residents measured heat by ash placement and fire duration rather than thermometer or guesswork. Each household rationed wood carefully. The smallest errors left gaps in warmth immediately noticeable on skin and clothing. Frost crept along walls where ceiling had failed, testing the patience and planning of every occupant. The authority figure, long accustomed to winter's recurring rigor, grew visibly skeptical. He moved from cabin to cabin, checking stores and observing stoves, his notes precise, his demeanor restrained. "Temperatures hold longer than memory expects," he remarked quietly to a neighbor while watching frost gather along a roofline. Even he could not fully predict which cabins would endure the prolonged sub-zero nights. Animals huddled in barns and sheds, their breath thick in frozen air. Cattle, previously grazed at intervals, now remained tethered in place to conserve energy. Chickens crowded in coops where wind had little access. Every movement demanded effort and calculation, as ice-coated tools and wood alike. The landscape itself seemed to dictate a slower rhythm to human activity, each step deliberate and controlled. Elias Harrow continued his routine within this environment. He checked bark-lined walls for moisture, adjusted the stove's airflow, and moved wood where it would burn most efficiently. His cabin showed no obvious weaknesses. The interior air remained steady despite the wind pressing against logs from the north and east. Light snow entered only where gaps and shutters persisted, yet even this was minor compared with the drafts elsewhere. Neighbors' cabins, by contrast, revealed subtle failures. Doors warped under repeated freeze and thaw cycles. Windows glistened with frost. Stoves burned faster than planned. Residents stayed closer to flames, moving cautiously and conserving strength. Observers noted these variations without commentary, understanding the practical consequences without the need for language. The valley's pressure became the central force of existence. Decisions were dictated by wind, snow, and the steady, unrelenting drop of temperature. Food stores, water access, and heat all required constant attention. The authority figure recorded adjustments and minor losses with impartial precision, aware that even careful preparation might not guarantee survival. The environment determined outcomes in ways that human judgment could only follow. Night after night, Elias maintained a watchful rhythm. Each fire was attended, each wall inspected, each layer of bark pressed tighter where gaps formed. The sub-zero temperatures persisted beyond any memory of recent winters. Wind and frost acted as silent observers, testing each cabin, each preparation. In this way, the valley measured its occupants quietly, without exception, revealing strength only through endurance rather than spectacle. A single storm descended over the valley with a persistence that left no path open. Snow accumulated steadily, drifts forming where wind funneled through narrow passes. Trails that once allowed passage between cabins became hidden under white, and the river froze in uneven sheets. Movement ceased entirely. The settlement withdrew indoors, tending fires and waiting, each occupant subject to the slow insistence of the weather, rather than any human measure. Elias Harrow's routine adjusted to the unrelenting storm. He checked each layer of bark along the cabin walls, pressing needles and moss into gaps where cold might find entry. The stove's airflow was monitored carefully, and fuel was placed at intervals calculated to maintain a steady warmth. Light dimmed through snow-covered windows, and the interior grew quieter as neighbors sought shelter. The rhythm of labor became observation. Fire, wall, fuel, repeat. Nothing was celebrated. Each check was recorded in thought, a methodical measure of temperature, air, and moisture. If you value learning from historical survival strategies, like, share, and subscribe for more stories. Unplanned visitors arrived as the storm continued. One neighbor, caught outside in the rising drift, entered with a small child, both covered in frozen powder. Another came from across the river, boots crusted in ice, seeking warmth and a short respite before returning home. They remained only as long as necessary. Elias offered seating, moved wood nearer, and ensured the stove continued to burn evenly. No conversation exceeded the minimum required. No assessment of the cabin's function was verbalized. The presence of others tested his routine without altering it. Outside, wind swept across the valley with relentless direction. Snow struck walls and roofs of other cabins, curling into drafts and infiltrating cracks. Fires burned quickly in insufficient stoves. Residents attended flames constantly, adjusting logs and checking ash beds. Each household endured cold according to preparation and circumstance. Losses and discomfort were noted silently. Within the bark-lined cabin, conditions remained comparatively steady. Temperatures fluctuated only slightly, dampness did not accumulate, and wind found little purchase on the interior. Observers could note the difference, but no acknowledgement passed between them or toward Elias. Function, not success, was the focus. The storm's duration allowed no distraction, no triumph. Only endurance was recorded, in bodies, fuel, and measured warmth. The night extended beyond any memory of duration. Hours merged into one another as snow fell and wind pressed against logs. The fire consumed wood at a predictable rate. the stove's metal radiating heat evenly. Elias moved from wall to stove, stove to wall, adjusting, observing, maintaining. The others rested briefly, shifting position near the stove, but did not interfere with the process. Each breath was visible in the cold interior, the atmosphere steady, the environment contained, restrained. By the storm's end, when wind slowed and snow drifted into uniform fields, the cabin had held through the test. No words were spoken to mark the occasion. Temperature readings, noted in passing, confirmed function without triumph. Outside, the valley bore scars of the storm. Drifted paths, frozen water, and structures compromised under persistent pressure. Elias Harrow's bark-lined walls remained intact, silently measuring their effectiveness. The long night had passed without spectacle, leaving only the evidence of preparation and quiet endurance. When the storm finally abated, the valley revealed the consequences of persistent cold. Cabins across the settlement bore signs of strain. Frost clung thickly to walls, and several roofs sagged under accumulated snow. Doors had warped, some no longer sealed, allowing wind to sweep along floors. Food stores suffered, with flour and root vegetables showing damp or spoilage. Livestock remained close to shelter, their movements slow from prolonged exposure and exertion. Elias Harrow's bark-lined cabin stood in contrast. The interior air maintained a steady temperature. Walls showed no frost, and the stove consumed wood at an even rate. Moisture collected outside but did not permeate the interior. No one entered the cabin seeking acknowledgement. Observers noted differences in passing, their attention practical rather than celebratory. Neighbors adjusted to reality quickly. One man, checking a warped doorway, remarked on the failure of conventional sealing methods. Another moved a stove closer to a window to conserve warmth. Dialogue remained concise, limited to essential observations about structural weaknesses and fuel management. No approval or ridicule was offered. The focus was entirely on continued survival. The elderly man by the river remained alive, his movements slowed by frost and fatigue, but he found no comparative comfort in Elias's cabin. Each resident calculated effort versus necessity, planning their day according to wind, light, and available heat. The valley's conditions continued to govern action. Human activity had become subordinate to environmental demand. Elias maintained the routine established throughout the winter. He added small pieces of bark where settling had created minor gaps, pressed moss where frost risk was greatest, and ensured the fire drew evenly without fluctuation. No commentary passed between him and visitors, who came only to move quickly or seek temporary shelter. Function, not recognition, guided every action. By mid-morning, the extent of damage elsewhere became clear. Several cabins required immediate repair. Frost inside one dwelling had forced the family to relocate bedding closer to the stove. Supplies were redistributed, and firewood rationed more strictly. Outside, drifted snow still accumulated against unmaintained walls. Elias's cabin required no such adjustments, its interior remaining stable without intervention. The settlement recognized, silently, that bark lining had functioned as intended. No one praised the method, and no laughter returned. Observers measured outcomes by effect on routine and effort required elsewhere. Comparative evidence was sufficient to mark success without words. The valley, indifferent as ever, had allowed one structure to withstand pressures that had compromised its neighbors. By afternoon, life resumed within practical limits. Paths were cleared slowly, stoves tended, animals fed, and essential tasks completed. Elias continued work within the cabin, maintaining stability for the remainder of the day. The storm's consequences persisted outside, but inside, measured proof existed quietly. Warmth maintained, moisture absent, and routine uninterrupted. Recognition came in the form of observation alone, a silent record of preparation validated by circumstance. Decades later, a witness who had lived through the winter recalled the events with unembellished clarity. The valley had endured much, and the storms of 1,889 remained a benchmark for survival. Recollections emphasized effort, observation, and adaptation rather than heroism. Each family remembered the storm by its effects: drifted snow, frozen stores, and the endurance required to remain warm and fed. Pine bark lining became quietly common. New cabins incorporated the material without ceremony as part of practical construction. Its origin was seldom cited. Builders followed instinct and prior observation, noting that interior temperatures remained steadier without attributing credit or myth. The valley adapted silently, accepting lessons as tools rather than stories. Elias Harrow's name persisted, not as an innovator, but as someone who had endured. Locals referred to the cabin by his family name, linking it to consistency and measured preparation rather than spectacle. Visitors could note the difference in structure, but no emphasis was placed on ingenuity. The valley itself remained the ultimate arbiter of success. Life continued according to seasonal rhythm. Snow melted in spring, ice receded, and paths reopened. Work resumed with routine attention to weather and terrain. Livestock, fields, and resources all followed a cycle that human memory had to accommodate. Tales were practical: who survived, how provisions held, what structures withstood the cold. Elias Harrow's endurance became a quiet reference point for preparation and diligence. No ceremony marked the adoption of bark lining, and no tale exaggerated events. The winter remained in memory as a standard, a measured example of what could be endured when effort and methodical care met relentless conditions. The valley remained unchanged, indifferent, its mountains and winds continuing as they always had, assessing those who lived within its reach with the same impartial scrutiny. If you appreciate carefully documented frontier survival stories, please like, share, and subscribe. Which preparation do you think mattered most for enduring that winter, Elias's bark-lined walls or his methodical routine?